So thank you so much, Sally, and thank you, Cooper. I'm really looking forward to the presentation tonight. The Water Dancer was chosen from 3 finalist titles to be this year's Adams County Reads One Book selection. It is a 2-year process to get to this evening's event, a year of reading many, many books, and a year of planning and implementing programming and discussions throughout the Adams County Library system. None of this would be possible without the Adams County Reads One Book Committee. Thank you to the current committee members, Barbara, Carol, Dave, Elizabeth, Emily, Janine, and Sarah, and to former committee members who contributed greatly to this year's program, Michelle, Steve, and Zach. I greatly appreciate each of you and your time and the effort you made in making each year's program a success. Special thanks to this year's Adams County Reads One Book sponsors, James and Kathy Gardner and WellSpan Health. Your sponsorship makes the Adams County Reads One Book program possible. So thank you so much for that. And just a quick note that there are many in-person and virtual programs for the One Book program taking place this month. So stop by your local library or visit our website at www.adamslibrary.org for more information. So back to you, Sally.
Thank you, Jess. So before we get started, again, we are recording this presentation, so you'll be able to see it on our YouTube channel. And even though attendees are muted and your cameras are off, we would love for you to participate by asking your questions in the Q&A box or the chat box at the bottom of your screen. And then Mr. Wingert will answer questions at the end of his presentation. So thank you again for attending this evening, and I'm delighted to introduce Cooper Wingert, who is an author of 10 books, an historian and current doctoral student at Georgetown University, and he's going to be presenting Slavery and Abolition in South Central Pennsylvania. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I had to get the unmute button, but we got it down now. I'm going to share my screen. So hopefully everyone is able to see that all right. Okay, excellent. So thank you to Jess and Sally for inviting me here to speak on this subject tonight. I'm interested to hear folks' thoughts on the Ta-Nehisi Coates novel too, about maybe what other dimensions of the Underground Railroad it adds. Just as a brief introduction to what I'll be covering tonight, I'll be talking about my book on slavery and Underground Railroad in South Central PA, which came out 5 years ago. And I initially set out to write a book about the Underground Railroad, pretty straightforward, I thought. But as I got more into the research, I became convinced that the story of the Underground Railroad really couldn't be told without first taking into account the history of slavery in Pennsylvania, from the colonial era all the way up into the early decades of the United States, in part because these stories overlap. So the book is divided in half, the first section focusing on slavery in Pennsylvania, the second on the Underground Railroad, and that's also how I structure this talk. So to start off, what do we mean when we say South Central Pennsylvania? I'm speaking to an audience, I can't tell over Zoom, but I'm assuming most of the folks are from Adams County or thereabouts. So I will spare you kind of the regional talk, but I am going to emphasize that I'm using modern county lines when I refer to things tonight, because county lines changed a lot over the course of the 18th and early 19th centuries. And if I were trying to refer to Chambersburg when it was in Cumberland County before 1784, it would get very confusing. But just a quick rundown, in 1749, York County is carved out and essentially is everything from the Susquehanna River west to the South Mountain Range. And then in 1800, Adams County is carved out of that, and they have their modern county lines. Cumberland County is a bit more complicated because it is basically everything west of the South Mountain, all the way out into Western Pennsylvania in a very ambiguous endpoint. But for today, we're just going to focus on Cumberland County and the other modern day county line that's carved out of it, Franklin County in 1784. So these are the 4 counties that I focus on in the book and where we'll limit ourselves to for this evening. Now, a lot of people are surprised at first when they hear that slavery existed in Pennsylvania, because Pennsylvania is known as the Quaker colony, and Quakers are known for their opposition to slavery. But Quakers, the Philadelphia meeting of Quakers, don't abolish slavery among their own ranks until 1774. So during the formative decades of Pennsylvania, when Quakers are the leading landholders and leading officials of the colony, it follows that they're also the leading slaveholders. And this also has to do with Quakers having connections to the West Indies. Philadelphia really grows because of its connections to islands like Barbados, where there's a lot of other Quaker planters who are in business with Quaker merchants in Philadelphia. So oftentimes these Quakers in Philadelphia were reluctant to speak out against slavery because they were profiting indirectly from it. Now, that said, slavery in Pennsylvania and the northern colonies looks very different from that in West Indies, or even the southern colonies like South Carolina, Virginia, or Maryland. And that's principally because there isn't a staple crop in Pennsylvania. In Maryland and Virginia, you have tobacco. In South Carolina, you have indigo and rice. Cotton doesn't come along until really the 1790s. But Pennsylvania lacks that staple crop. And as a result, slavery as it develops in Pennsylvania looks very different. The average slaveholder in the 1700s in Pennsylvania holds about 1 or 2 enslaved people in bondage. By contrast, the average slaveholder in a place like Virginia holds about 21 people in bondage. So it looks a lot different. And unlike slave plantations in the South, where there are so many enslaved people that there are separate slave quarters, if you've been to a place like Monticello or Mount Vernon, you'll see these structures that are separate from the main plantation house. In the northern colonies, like Pennsylvania, most often enslaved people slept under the same roof as their enslaver. And it's tempting to jump to a conclusion from the differences in the way slavery looks, that slavery was somehow milder or better in the northern colonies than it was in the southern colonies. But we should be careful about making that leap, because oftentimes the close proximity at which enslaved people and masters found themselves created more opportunities for different types of emotional, physical, or even sexual abuse. So I said earlier that the average slaveholder in the North owns 1 or 2 people. However, there are exceptions, and slavery moves pretty quickly into the Cumberland Valley. And here are a couple of the notable exceptions. This is a slaveholder named Philip Davis, who lives in Peters Township, which is modern day Southwest Franklin County. And he holds 7 enslaved people. So he is one of the largest slaveholders in South Central Pennsylvania. He would actually be one of the smallest slaveholders in a place like Virginia by comparison. But Davis has 7 people he owns, and he has 6 children. So what do you think he does? He wills 1 enslaved person to each of his children, and the 7th, a woman named Mary, he wills to his wife. 10 years later, there's another really rich slaveholder named Henry Pauling, who lives near modern day Greencastle. And he has a huge plantation, a lot of animals, and he also owns 8 people. And this is a really good example of, in the colonial era, we have very little documentation about slavery. And we have almost no accounts from enslaved people themselves. And slaveholders really didn't write about enslaved people. The only traces and scraps we have in the archive are usually from legal documents like estate inventories. But we can still learn a lot about what life was like under slavery during this era from really reading these documents carefully. And so Pauling's estate inventory is simply a list of everything and everyone he owned. But one of the key things is it's listed in order as those people taking the inventory went through his house and his property. And one of the notable things is that there is a bed specifically designated for his slaves that's listed among the kitchen inventory. And we know from a lot of other examples that enslaved people in northern colonies often lived in a small crawl space above their enslaver's kitchen. So that was likely where most, if not all, of the 8 people Pauling owned lived, in a small space above his kitchen. And there's other examples of this. One of the more notable ones is actually in Gettysburg, where you've probably heard of the Dobbin House, which is a well-known local restaurant, historic building. And the Dobbin House sometimes advertises that there is this small crawl space above the 1776 historic kitchen that may have been, has been rumored to have been part of the Underground Railroad. And they've got part of the story right. One of the younger Dobbins, the son of the man who originally built the house, later does become an abolitionist, but only after he goes bankrupt, loses the house in court, and moves to Franklin County in Quincy, Franklin County, where he becomes an abolitionist while he's bunking with someone else as a school teacher. So, and the Dobbin House originally was built by Reverend Alexander Dobbin in the 1770s, who was a slaveholder. So it's likely that this small space above the historic kitchen was probably where Dobbin's own slaves lived and slept, rather than runaways on their journey through the Underground Railroad. So again, this is why I think it's important to tell the stories of slavery and the Underground Railroad together, rather than to separate them apart. And I said, on the surface, slavery in the northern colonies looks very different from the type of plantation slavery that's emerging in the South. But there are a lot of similarities. People in the North, enslaved people in the North, run away as well, and their slaveholders try to recapture them. This is a runaway ad from Carlisle in 1788. Now that brings us to the American Revolution. And the American Revolution is really important because it sectionalizes slavery for the first time. In colonial America, slavery is everywhere. It looks very different in the northern colonies than it does in the southern colonies. But after the Revolution, or I should say during the Revolution, a number of northern colonies take steps to end slavery. And there are 3 states that do so during the Revolution itself, and a number follow. In the 1784 and on, a number of different states also pass gradual emancipation acts. But the 3 states that do it during the Revolution abolish slavery in very different ways. And they're instructive to pay attention to how they abolish slavery. Vermont is the first in 1777. And Vermont did not exist before. It was carved out of New York. And they adopt a constitution which abolishes slavery, says slavery is illegal. And this more or less ends slavery in Vermont, but there are some court cases that go on until 1806. The second state to abolish slavery is Pennsylvania, and they do that in 1780. And Pennsylvania does it by legislation. The state legislature passes a law and says slavery will be gradually phased out. The third state that abolishes slavery during the Revolution is Massachusetts, which does it in 1783. But in Massachusetts, it's by judicial action. 2 enslaved people, Elizabeth Freeman and Quock Walker, sue their slaveholders in court because they say the Bill of Rights, which says that the state's Bill of Rights that says that everyone is entitled to liberty, their rights are being violated by being held in slavery, and they win. And slavery in Massachusetts effectively ends more or less immediately in 1783. So you have by constitution, by legislation, and by judicial action. Of these 3, Pennsylvania is by far the slowest and most painfully long process of them all. It's the only state, it's actually the first state anywhere in the world to abolish racial slavery by legislation. But the law is very slow acting. It says that anyone who was born before March 3rd, 1780, that's the day the law is passed, they are a slave for life. There's no light at the end of the tunnel for them. But anyone born after March 3rd, 1780 will become free on their 28th birthday. So in theory, the law doesn't free a single person until 1808. That's not exactly true. We'll talk about some of the court cases, but it's very much an example of kicking the can down the road. So Pennsylvania's law leaves a lot of people behind. And there, one example, there was an enslaved woman who had been born in the 1750s, and her eldest child was born in 1777. So he is a slave for life. But her 2 youngest children were born just months after the Gradual Emancipation Act. So they have this distant glimmer of freedom down the road. So this law quite literally cuts across families. But for historians, it's extremely important, because in the 18th century, you don't have birth certificates, but you have a law that depends on age for its enforcement. So how are you going to keep track? And are you going to trust slaveholders, or are you going to trust enslaved people to tell you their actual birth date? So state lawmakers require registries, slave registries, be created in every county across Pennsylvania. And unfortunately, not all of these survive. But for luckily for us, Cumberland County's does survive. And it's one of the most detailed slave registers from across the state that actually is still extant. So it gives us an unprecedented insight into the lives of enslaved people. It gives us their names, it gives us where they lived, it gives us their ages, and we can start to piece together their stories in conjunction with runaway ads and other pieces of material that we have in the archives. Like I said earlier, in the colonial era, we know virtually nothing about enslaved people. We oftentimes don't even know their names. We just know the number on the tax roll. Whereas after 1780, we have a much richer portrait of what it was like to be enslaved in Pennsylvania. And that's how I'm able to produce maps like this that show the number of enslaved people per township. And this is what a slave registry looks like. And just to give you an idea of the gradualness, again, this is a gradual emancipation with an emphasis on the gradual. Every single person you see on this particular slave registration, from Paul to Isabel, they are all enslaved for life. So the law that this much touted Gradual Emancipation Act does nothing for them. Now, we're not so fortunate in Adams County and Gettysburg, and that's because the slave registry for York County is missing. Nobody has ever found it. Maybe someday a scholar will stumble across it, but so far it's still missing. So we don't have anything, any particular slave register for York County. We do have a slave register for Adams County, but it only starts in 1800 after Adams County is carved out of York. So for those first 20 years, when slavery is at its height in Pennsylvania, we don't have documentation for Adams County. The next best thing we have is the 1783 tax. And we know that tax collectors weren't always the most precise when enumerating enslaved people. So we don't know exactly how accurate this is. I suspect this is actually a slight undercount. But the one pattern you can discern is that outside of York, the city itself, the kind of a hotspot, where slavery is strongest, is in what is now southwestern Adams County in Cumberland and Hamilton Band townships. And obviously you can tell the township lines have changed quite considerably since the 1780s. Now, slaveholders don't take this lying down. Remember that at this point, the state legislature still meets in Philadelphia. And in Eastern Pennsylvania by this time, slavery is on the decline, it's crumbling. The Quaker meeting, and remember Quakers have a huge influence in Eastern Pennsylvania. They have abolished slavery among their members in 1774. And that means that you have a huge element of the population now anti-slavery, now that whether they want to or whether they're being forced by their fellow congregants to do so, there is a huge anti-slavery impulse in Eastern Pennsylvania, and there's a transition from enslaved labor to white indentured servants. The same does not happen in South Central Pennsylvania, partly because there's no bridge across the Susquehanna River. So oftentimes folks in South Central Pennsylvania have closer connections to slaveholding Maryland than they do Eastern Pennsylvania. And also, slavery had arrived in Pennsylvania more recently than it had in the South Central Pennsylvania more recently than it had in Eastern Pennsylvania. So a lot of slaveholders are reluctant to give up their property rights, or what they see as their property rights. And these are comments that I actually found scrawled on the back of slave registrations. It's like a Facebook comment section of the 1780s. This is George Stevenson. He's a Carlisle lawyer and slaveholder. He calls it a useless act of the General Assembly, and he hopes that the clerk will be paid his $2 per each person to register, which is the only good thing in the act, for it will help to pay his tax. Then we have Francis Campbell, a Shippensburg merchant and slaveholder, who complains that the law is attended with some difficulties, which are so surprising that gentlemen who esteem themselves men of sense and wish to be in high reputation with their neighbors should spend time and load the inhabitants with expenses in making such frivolous laws as respect the matter in hand. Now, it's important to remember that for what for Stevenson and Campbell is a useless act or a frivolous law, for enslaved people in Pennsylvania, it is an imperfect but important mechanism for freedom. Now, I said earlier, gradual emancipation with an emphasis on the gradual. And this is 30 years later, in 1810, after the passage of the Gradual Emancipation Act, the number of enslaved people in Cumberland County has actually ticked upwards. And while slavery has really died out throughout most of the state, in South Central Pennsylvania, these 4 counties, Cumberland, Franklin, York, and Adams, 60% of the state's entire enslaved population is within these 4 counties. Again, partly because of the proximity to the South, partly because many residents are more connected socially and economically to slaveholding Maryland and Virginia than they are to Eastern Pennsylvania. Now, what's important about this, though, so that in 1810 is kind of the high watermark of slavery in Pennsylvania. And after this, each year, a new generation of so-called term slaves reaches the age of 28 and they gain their freedom. So the number of slaves declines precipitously after 1810. But the reason I bring this up, and it's important, is slaveholders like Campbell and Stevenson, they don't just give up. They fight tooth and nail to extend terms of enslavement as long as possible. So if a enslaved person runs away even for a couple of weeks, slaveholders will go to court and try to get their 28-year term of service extended by 2 or 3 years. And as a result, enslaved people in Pennsylvania have to keep slaveholders honest by going to the courts. And they go to the courts and they often will sue masters for not following the provisions of the Gradual Emancipation Act, for incorrectly filing their birth data. And this is really important because it provides a foundation for the type of activism that we'll see on the Underground Railroad, that this turning to courts, informal networks among African Americans to know where they can turn for assistance. And it's kind of a homegrown tradition of activism. And the reason why, I start with the history of slavery is the resistance. The Underground Railroad doesn't start in the 1830s, 1840s, right before the Civil War. It starts as an opposition to slavery in Pennsylvania. And then it grows into an opposition to slavery more nationally, and slavery in the South. So that brings us finally to the Underground Railroad. And there are a few subjects in American history which are shrouded in as much myth as the Underground Railroad. And hopefully we'll wade through some and separate fact from fiction. Now, the Underground Railroad really became romanticized and mythologized in the 1890s. That was when the first academic historian to start researching it, a man named Wilbur Siebert, who taught at Ohio State, he started canvassing the North, and he would interview abolitionists who by this time were pretty old. He would interview their sons and daughters, and he just loved good stories. Sometimes he'd let his love for a good story get in the way of facts. And he had this, he wrote a number of books on Underground Railroad, but his basic argument was that there was this one centralized organization throughout the North that was enticing people to escape from slavery and then was facilitating their escape through the North. And for decades, this held sway among historians until the 1960s, when a new generation of historians started to criticize Siebert. And these are historians like Larry Guerra, who wrote The Liberty Line. And they argued that the exact opposite, that there was really no organization, that enslaved people escaped largely on their own. They went from the border states in the South up into the North, and they were pretty much on their own. They got help occasionally, but there was no organized network, and the Underground Railroad was really the stuff of legend. And now in the past decade or two, historians have started to find a middle ground, and they agree that there wasn't this centralized nervous system like Siebert said, but there were a series of local networks that were operating in an organized fashion. They were interlocking. So instead of thinking of kind of one central nervous system, think about these many different little local networks, these many different cogs that made the Underground Railroad function. And those local networks were called Vigilance Committees. If there's one thing that you can walk away from this presentation tonight, learning about the Underground Railroad, I hope it is the concept of Vigilance Committees, because this is, to me, the most important thing to understanding what the Underground Railroad actually was. Vigilance, the idea of a Vigilance Committee is somewhat unfamiliar to us today. It's not a term we hear bandied about often, but it was a 19th century concept. It was very familiar. There were vigilance committees for all sorts of things. So for instance, during the California gold rushes, when the mining settlements were cropping up so fast that they outpaced the ability of authorities to kind of establish law and townships and all the normal processes of civil authority, miners and citizens would band together and form vigilance committees, which essentially were like neighborhood watch groups to assure that there was some semblance of law and order and people didn't go around murdering each other for gold. And anti-slavery vigilance committees draw on the same concept of vigilance committees. Neighborhood watches, self-protection societies is what they were called sometimes. And they start as a response to kidnapping, when slave catchers from the South would come into the North and target free African Americans, often free African American children. But very quickly they become receptacles for freedom seekers who are escaping from the South into the North. And these are, the important thing to remember about vigilance committees is they have a public face and they have a private face. Much of what they're doing is in the public eye, and they're part of what historians are now starting to call the first civil rights movement. We often think of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, 1950s, 1960s. Historians are now saying there's actually a first civil rights movement that starts from the 1820s and goes all the way into the decades up to the Civil War. And that's the fight against slavery and the fight for African-American equality in its first iteration. And what vigilance committees do is they lobby state legislatures to recognize that they should have basic rights, the right to testify in court in their own defense, the right to, when a slave catcher comes, that the burden of proof should be on the slave catcher, not an African-American person, to prove that they're not enslaved. And they actually win a lot of battles. They don't win them all, but they get pretty much every northern state by the time of the Civil War to pass what are known as personal liberty laws. And again, these are basically just recognizing essential rights for African Americans, protecting against kidnapping, and providing some key safeguards. So they're not perfect, but they are important milestones, and they really upset slaveholders, as we'll see. But at the same time, vigilance committees are also breaking the law, even as they're working in public to get state laws in northern states that are more favorable for African American residents. They are they're sheltering freedom seekers. They're providing them food. They're oftentimes forwarding them on to the next city. So you see here at the right, this is the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee, and they would routinely send freedom seekers from Philadelphia on to New York. If it was deemed safe enough that they weren't being immediately pursued, oftentimes vigilance committees would try to help the person find employment. So there's this dual face to vigilance committees that's really important to understand. But these committees are the backbone of the Underground Railroad. And here's an example of one in Gettysburg. This is the Slaves Refuge Society. It was formed out of the AME Church in Gettysburg in the winter of 1841. And again, this is a public newspaper announcement of the society's mission. We feel it our indispensable duty to assist such of our brethren as shall come among us for the purpose of liberating themselves, and to raise all the means in our power to effect our object, which is to give liberty to our brethren groaning under the tyrannical yoke of oppression. So it's an abolitionist newspaper, but anybody could have read it. So vigilance committees are not only advocating for laws, but they're publicly bragging about how many laws, the federal fugitive slave laws, that they're breaking. And they are calling out the hypocrisy of slaveholders in doing so. And this is an important to mention. The Underground Railroad is so effective at driving the tensions that lead to the Civil War up because it's so well known. It's such an open secret. There's another vigilance committee that forms in Harrisburg in the mid-1850s, and this is known as the Fugitive Aid Society. And once again, as you can see from the clipping at the right, they are boasting publicly about their exploits and how many people they've helped escape from slavery. And remember, at this point in the 1840s and 1850s, slaveholders are defending slavery by, saying it is a benign institution, that enslaved people actually are happy, they're contented, they're well treated. And what Underground Railroad activists are doing is they are telling the Northern public, no, slavery is so bad, it's so awful, that people will do anything they can to get away from it. They'll leave their families behind and go into a land where they don't really know anybody to get their freedom and exit slavery. And that's really the effectiveness of the Underground Railroad. And here in Harrisburg, it's again led by local African-American activists. And one of the things I like to point out is this is actually a very common tactic among Underground Railroad and vigilance leaders, is they will buy actual train tickets and put freedom seekers aboard actual trains. So the Underground Railroad is a metaphor, but it also sometimes there is actually a train, not underground, but above ground, that enslaved people are using to get to freedom. And I also want to double back. One of the important reasons why, and this is what surprises people, is they tend to think of the Underground Railroad as this secretive organization, because the legend has it that abolitionists would be, harshly punished if their activities were ever known. But the important part is that there are very different laws in the northern states than there are in the southern states. So abolitionists who are caught in the southern states are convicted for lengthy prison spells. It doesn't take much to convince a slaveholding jury to convict an abolitionist. There are abolitionists who usually get anywhere from 5 to 20 years in state penitentiaries in the South. But in the northern states, there are very few laws that actually target abolitionists. The laws actually target slave catchers, as we'll see in just a second. And the vast majority of Northerners are not willing to hand down harsh sentences for abolitionists. Even though there's a federal law, a fugitive slave law, it's rarely enforced in the North. And abolitionists, the most they often receive is 10 to 20 days in prison, really a slap on the wrist. So abolitionists in the North are empowered to speak out because of this lax enforcement in a way that abolitionists in the South can't. And that really drives slaveholders crazy. So this is a kind of a map of the broader region. This is as the Underground Railroad develops in the 1840s and 1850s. And what I want you to imagine is that each of these kind of Gettysburg, Chambersburg, Quincy, Carlisle, Mount Holly, they're each kind of their own local network, but they're interlocking with one another. So there's no central nervous system, but there are a number of different local vigilance committees that are cooperating with each other and helping freedom seekers escape. And in the question and answer section, if you have specific questions about this map, we can come back and talk more about this. But this is generally the directions that were most frequently taken by enslaved people from Maryland and Virginia who are escaping across our region of Pennsylvania. So I want us to try to put a face to all of this, and that is to tell a personal story of one enslaved Marylander who escapes through Adams County, and that is a man named James Pennington. So Pennington was enslaved near Hagerstown, and he was hired out or rented as an enslaved blacksmith. And Pennington, one winter in the late 1820s, decides he's had enough. He witnesses a punishment of a family member that he feels was just gratuitously abusive, and he decides to take flight. And he has more or less no help while he's escaping from Maryland. He actually starts going in the wrong direction. Only a good Samaritan points out the way to him that he was heading to Baltimore, not away from it. Pennington crosses the Pennsylvania border, but there's still a lot of uncertainty. He's been several days without food. He has really no sense of direction. It's only once he stumbles into northern Adams County that he comes across William and Phoebe Wright. And they are Quaker abolitionists who live, at the time they lived near Bendersville. They later move out to Lattimore Township in northeastern Adams County. But it's by chance that Pennington meets up with the Wrights. But once he meets up with the Wrights, they are able to forward him on to another local network in Harrisburg, and then he eventually reaches New York City. And Pennington becomes a leading abolitionist and a leading figure in the fight against slavery. He hangs out with the likes of Frederick Douglass. He gives speeches during the Civil War urging African Americans to enlist in the Union Army. And he writes his own memoir, jumped ahead there. He writes his own memoir called The Fugitive Blacksmith, which if you're looking for a first-person account of what it was like to escape from slavery, this is one of the best. It includes his experience in Adams County. You'll note also that it was published in 1849. So this is still when the Underground Railroad is operating. It's still when William and Phoebe Wright are helping freedom seekers in northern Adams County. He abbreviates their names. He calls them WW and PW. But pretty much everyone in the local area knew who he was talking about because again, the operations of the Underground Railroad were more or less an open secret because abolitionists like the Wrights had relatively little to fear in the way of punishment under Northern state laws. So I mentioned earlier that the Underground Railroad plays a key role in the coming of the Civil War. And I want to expand on that by way of a story that takes place in Carlisle on June 2nd, 1847. So 2 Maryland slave catchers from Hagerstown, they track down 3 freedom seekers near Shippensburg, they capture them, and they take them to Carlisle for what they think is a routine judicial hearing in which they will essentially get their paperwork, red stamped, and they will take off with their 3 captives back to Maryland. It should have been an easy process. However, and this is the importance of vigilance committees and this long tradition of suing slaveholders in court and getting the word out, vigilance committees very quickly mobilize a large crowd of African-American residents from Carlisle outside the courthouse. Remember, this is before Facebook. This is before walkie-talkies or cell phones. They managed to, through word of mouth, spread the alarm very quickly. Within minutes, there's a large crowd outside the courthouse. And all of a sudden, it becomes very clear that what was supposed to be a very simple handoff where the slaveholders go back to Maryland is going to be much more complicated. And the African-American community in Carlisle also knows which lawyers to contact. And they bring abolitionist lawyers into the hearing room who in turn start to sue the slaveholders for violating Pennsylvania's personal liberty law. So we have this kind of complicated standoff. Eventually, the judge sorts through it and he rules that the slaveholders are ultimately in the right and that they can return to Maryland with their captives in tow. But as they're escorting the 3 captives out of the courthouse down those steps you see in the photograph, there is a rescue attempt. An African-American activist rescued 2 of the 3 freedom seekers. And there's a big controversy because one of the slaveholders is trampled to death in the process. And there's a lengthy court case. There's actually a Dickinson College professor named John McClintock who was accused of, he's one of the white abolitionists who comes into the hearing room and accuses the slaveholders of violating the Northern state law. And there's a lengthy trial. Several African Americans in Carlisle are convicted and sentenced to the state penitentiary. Their convictions later overturned, but McClintock is acquitted, much to the outrage of Southerners. And what this incident really demonstrates, that this is national news. It happens in Carlisle, but it's national news. It's debated in Congress. It really reveals how vigilance committees in the Underground Railroad challenged the type of nation that slaveholders and Southerners wanted to have. The slaveholders argued that they should be able to go anywhere in the country and their rights to property and human beings would be protected, that they wanted the federal government not to be neutral in the fight over slavery. The federal government should actively protect their right to own human beings. Whereas vigilance committees and northern states that had passed these personal liberty laws, they're presenting a challenge to that. They're saying, no, freedom should be the norm and slavery should be the exception. So so the Underground Railroad isn't just about dramatic escapes. It really is about what kind of a nation the United States should be. And this is that I mentioned earlier, this idea of the first civil rights movement. Don't think of Underground Railroad activists and abolitionists as operating in the dark of night. They are fighting slaveholders in public, in courtrooms, in the streets, attempting rescues. And they're making it clear that they're not going to let the United States become this, unambiguously pro-slavery nation. They're fighting for a very different future. So to wrap up, I want to talk about I want to try to connect the Underground Railroad to the Civil War. So I've just talked about how the Underground Railroad really ratchets up sectional tensions and about what kind of nation the United States should be. When Confederates invade Pennsylvania in 1863, leading to the Battle of Gettysburg, they have not forgotten about the Underground Railroad. And it's one of the lesser known chapters of the Battle of Gettysburg, but Confederates immediately go about, as they enter Pennsylvania, enslaving any African Americans they encounter. This happens in Franklin County, it happens in Adams County, to a lesser extent in Cumberland and York counties, because by that time the word had gotten out and most African-American residents had fled. But, and we don't know for sure how many, but a conservative estimate is several hundred Black Pennsylvanians are swept up by the Confederate Army. And this was not just the actions of individualized soldiers, this went well up in the command structure. We know that, for instance, the Confederate General James Longstreet was aware of this from letters that he exchanged. George Pickett's division, which later participated in Pickett's charge, the reason they don't arrive on the battlefield until July 3rd is they were guarding African-American captives in Chambersburg on July 1st. That's why they're so late to the battle. And this is a often overlooked chapter, and many Confederates phrase this, enlisted men and officers, as kind of a continuation of the fight about the Underground Railroad, that for decades, Northerners were enticing away their slaves, so now they are taking the opportunity to recover them, even though many of these people were proven to be born free on Pennsylvania soil. There's one story that's very intriguing that I wanted to highlight, and that's the story of Amos Barnes. Amos Barnes was a free Black man who lived in Mercersburg, which is in very far western edge of Franklin County. And when the Confederates arrive in Mercersburg, Barnes allegedly leads them to the hiding places of different runaway slaves in an exchange that if he leads the Confederates to other Black people, that he himself will be spared. But Confederates go back on their word, and Barnes is with the other captives taken and sent to this prison here on the right, Castle Thunder Prison in Richmond. And ultimately, it is two Dickinson College graduates, one on the left, Thomas Cray, who is a minister in Mercersburg, and another former a native of Newville, T.V. Moore, who was then living in Richmond as a minister, who collaborate. They get the Confederate Secretary of War to release Barnes. He's one of the very few Black captives who's actually released by the Confederate State Department. And the reason for his release is because he claimed he was helping the Confederates. So they didn't release him because he was free. They released him because he had been actively helping the Confederates, or so he claimed. But the mystery, we don't know for sure. Was Barnes actually working as a Confederate agent, or was he simply spinning a very convincing story that Confederate authorities bought in order to get its freedom? We'll never quite know. But it's an intriguing bookend to the African-American experience in the Gettysburg campaign, and a story that has particularly interested me in the recent years. So with that said, I want to wrap up with a thought about what I hope you take away from the Underground Railroad, besides the phrase vigilance committees. And that is that it's the Underground Railroad we often think of as this secretive, organization that only operated in the dark of night. And it wasn't, the Underground Railroad was not only a clandestine network. It was really the first stage in a civil rights movement that leads to the Civil War, and then the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments to the Constitution, and ultimately is picked up in the 1950s and 1960s. And really what Underground Railroad activists are doing, besides the very practical thing of helping people escape slavery and get to freedom, is they really are challenging what kind of a nation the United States will be. And they are saying that slaveholders' vision of slavery national, that slavery should be the default status in the United States for Black people, they're saying that is not going to stand. And that's why I think the Underground Railroad is so important. And we're not doing justice to Underground Railroad agents and to the men and women who escaped along the Underground Railroad if we simply tell the stories of their daring escapes. We should talk about what they did in public too to oppose slavery. So with that, thank you, and we will open the floor for questions.
Well, just looking in the chat here, I know that there are some in our Q&A section, but one of the questions that came up in chat, can you speak about how Prigg versus Pennsylvania caused tensions between political leadership in Maryland and Pennsylvania?
Excellent question. Sorry about the unmute. I forgot that I muted myself again. So the Prigg versus Pennsylvania is an 1842 case, and what it stems from is a Maryland slave catcher who goes into Pennsylvania, and he's convicted under Pennsylvania laws. And these are these personal liberty laws that I mentioned earlier, which are really crucial, and they're part of the Underground Railroad. It's not, the Underground Railroad isn't just daring escapes, it's also laws and court cases, which might sound boring, but they're really important. And Pennsylvania had passed this law in 1826 that again made it very difficult for slaveholders to come into the state and recapture runaways. It basically shifted the burden of proof from runaways to slaveholders. And as a result, because this Maryland slave catcher hadn't gone through the procedure outlined in that law, which effectively would have delayed it and made it difficult for him to catch this particular runaway, the state of Pennsylvania convicted him. And his case was appealed up to the Supreme Court, which the Supreme Court then says that the northern state laws are unconstitutional, that northern states can't place all these requirements on slaveholders. So then northern states just change their strategy. They say, okay, we're going to take a hands-off approach. We're not going to help slaveholders at all. And they pass a new round of personal liberty laws that make it illegal for northern state officials to help slaveholders, and basically shift everything to the federal government, which really doesn't have that much of a presence in the northern states. So basically what they do is they withdraw all governmental aid from slaveholders and make slaveholders responsible for catching runaways on their own, which is almost even worse for slaveholders. So to the effect that this had between Prigg versus Pennsylvania had on relations between Maryland and Pennsylvania, it definitely ratchets them up, because Maryland's governor is continually inundating Pennsylvania with requests for them to change their state laws. And in the 1820s, they do, but in the 1840s, the politics have changed enough that it's very unpopular for a northern politician to be seen as serving the interests of slaveholders and Southerners. So northern states stick to their guns throughout the late 1840s and 1850s. And if you look at the Maryland governor's papers, there are a lot of angry and terse letters between Pennsylvania and Maryland authorities. So certainly it definitely makes relations worse. And I will say the thing that really makes relations worse is the Christiana resistance in 1851, which is where a number of free African Americans actually kill a slaveholder who's trying to capture runaways in Lancaster County. And this incident really outrages Maryland, because the slaveholder was from Maryland, and that that kind of drives a huge wedge between Maryland and Pennsylvania. Jess, I think you need to unmute.
I am so sorry. So another question, how did the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act impact these anti-slavery organizations in Adams County and in southeastern PA?
Sure. So the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, I like to say its bark is worse than its bite. It's this notorious law. It's probably the worst law ever passed in American history, because it denied African Americans the right to any semblance of a fair trial. They couldn't even testify in their own defense. They could be, in theory, that's how the law was written, but it was rarely ever enforced that way, because remember, northern states had adopted this hands-off approach, this idea that it is illegal for a Pennsylvania official to help a slaveholder. So slaveholders need to turn to somebody else. They turn to the federal government, but the federal government doesn't have that many officials in the North. And the officials it does have in the North, they're known as U.S. commissioners. They are part-time federal employees. So they still get most of their money from working in northern communities. So if you're a lawyer in Gettysburg and you know that your neighbors are very opposed to the fugitive slave law, are you going to take on a case as a federal commissioner and then lose all of your law clients? Probably not. That actually happens in Harrisburg, where a Harrisburg lawyer named Richard McAllister becomes a commissioner, and he starts enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act, and he goes bankrupt. People won't patronize his law firm anymore. He ends up having to move to Kansas. So the the Fugitive Slave Act doesn't have that much of an influence on the Underground Railroad in Pennsylvania. It certainly has a lot of, again, there's a lot of drama surrounding it. And it's very controversial, but practically speaking, the Underground Railroad and throughout most of the North, the law is unenforceable. The Underground Railroad and vigilance operatives fight back, and for the most part, they're successful. They hold off the federal government, which is really an impressive story that a lot of people don't recognize.
Okay, so what about the Underground Railroad in the Confederate States?
So there are two ways we can go with this question. So I think you're talking about the Underground Railroad during the Civil War, but to address before the Civil War, the Underground Railroad in the Southern states, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, there are big differences in the Southern state laws and Northern state laws. So abolitionists have much more to risk and much more to lose in the Southern states if they're caught than they do in the Northern states. So there are Underground Railroad activists in the South, both white and black, though their activities are nowhere near as public as they are in the Northern states. But there are abolitionists. We know this because there are many of them who actually are convicted. And for those who are convicted, we're sure there are probably many more who were not convicted. During the Civil War, that actually changes a lot because no longer are enslaved people in the South running to the Northern states. They're now running to the nearest Union Army encampment. And Union soldiers overwhelmingly, pretty early in the war, start to sympathize with enslaved people. And even before the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, when runaways reach Union lines, Union soldiers generally protect them. It's not all the time, but generally speaking, Union soldiers shelter runaways. So during the Civil War in the Confederate States, the Underground Railroad changes from running from the South to the North to running to somewhere closer to home, which was wherever the Union Army was.
Okay. Do you have any information about a colored cemetery located on Yellow Hill Road, Butler Township, Adams County?
I do not, but there is a book about that written by Deb McCausland. I believe it's called Yellow Hill, A Story of a Community. She is the expert on it, and her book, I think it was published in 2007. But you should be able to find that perhaps in the Adams County Library System or at a local bookstore.
Yes, we do have a copy in the Adams County Library System, including a copy of your book. I'll just hold that up here. So we have a copy of that in the library system as well. There have been numerous comments in the chat. Thank you for the presentation. Excellent presentation. Very good command and knowledge of the history. Wonderful delivery. Great scholarship. Any other questions? Okay, so it looks like there is a twofold question. John T. Lewis was from Carroll County, Maryland, and a friend of Mark Twain. He was reportedly in Gettysburg before and or during the early years of the war. He was a member of the Brethren Church and helped return the Bible to the Dunkirk Church at Antietam. So that said, was the Brethren Church anti-slavery in its orientation like the Methodist Church?
So that one I do not know. I'm not an expert on religion. There are others. Cheryl LaRoche's work I would recommend for religion. I don't know the answer to that question, but it's a good question and certainly something fertile avenue for future research.
Okay, and a few more just comments of thank you for the presentation. And yes, I mean, thank you so much for this presentation. It was just fascinating.
Of course, thank you for inviting me here. It was a pleasure.
And someone said in Q&A that you're the best, so.
Well, thank you.
I don't see any more questions. So I guess we'll wrap up.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This was very, very interesting, and I sure learned a lot. I'm sorry I had technical difficulties there and I missed it a little bit there,
No
but
worries.
this was a great presentation, and we appreciate everybody joining us this evening.
All right. Have a
Thank-
good evening, everyone.
Good night.